Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is Jeremy Whitley, creator of Princeless. Jeremy, welcome to Comic Culture.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, let's get started. What was the inspiration for creating Princeless?
Princeless was created largely because I was thinking about having a daughter, and my wife and I were planning at that point, and I was thinking about how much I wanted to share comics and my love of comics with her. Comics is a big part of my life, and I was creating my own comics even before Princeless. Um, so I wanted something that she could see herself in as a young woman of color, but also would have sort of the aspirational aspects of a a girl who is a hero, who a princess who saves herself, rather than the princesses that we get so much of in the culture that kids are fed, where they can't really do anything for themselves. They sit around and sleep. It's kind of that's Sleeping Beauty's superpower, is she sleeps a lot.
It is a powerful power.
I'd like to have that one sometimes.
Well, it is interesting because it seems that a lot of female characters in comics are there to be rescued rather than to further the story along. And that's certainly not the case in Princeless. So you come up with the idea. It's I think, an inspired concept. So how does it go from the idea stage to being an Eisner-nominated book?
It started off with me kind of playing with the idea of the initial story I wanted to tell of her rescuing herself, and writing out a script for a comic before I had an artist to go along with it. And the I first worked with my friend Franco, who is a graphic artist who lives here in Durham, and we did a first issue of it, and it wasn't super successful, and it was a little bit rougher than what ended up coming out eventually. Um, so we kind of went our separate ways. Franco was still doing his art, and I still wanted to do something with it, so I was carrying around a bunch of unsold issue ones with me. I ended up sitting next to Dave Dwanch at HeroesCon in Charlotte, and it was just as Action Lab was forming, so they were all sort of coming together to make comics together instead of everybody self-publishing their own stuff all the time. And it just it happened to be that he was next to me the whole weekend, and he got to hear the pitch a lot, and got a copy of the comic from me, and wrote me an email a week later and was like, "Yeah, I really like this. This is the kind of thing I'd love for our company to be doing." And I was like, "Well, guess what? I don't have an artist. I'm not doing anything with it right now. So I'd love for you guys to do it too."
That's interesting. So it seems that a lot of business goes on behind the scenes at some of these larger comic conventions. I know that San Diego Comic Con has sort of become the place where the entertainment industry announces their newest series or franchise or movie projects or something like that. But it seems like, from what you're saying, that a lot happens behind the scenes with the comic creators maybe bouncing ideas off one another, or maybe coming up with a project that they want to work on.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conventions where you get a lot of creators sort of in the same room, and people are meeting each other who've been sort of admiring each other's work from a distance for a while, and you get all that creativity in one spot, and then at some point you end up adding food and alcohol to that, and eventually people start coming up with ideas, or they start bouncing things that they've been thinking about off of each other. And I think it's sort of the nature of comic writers and illustrators that when they hear like a half of an idea, they're like, "Oh, and then this has to happen, and that has to happen, and here's a great idea of where to go from there." So you end up, a lot of people hooking up, forming what'll end up being creator-owned books or things that they pitch later on to some of the bigger companies. And I think that's where a lot of the initial meeting goes on. I mean, pretty much, with the exception of the guys who are local here, I think just about everybody I've worked with I met first at a convention.
So After you meet the folks at Action Lab and they have interest in the project, how do you then go about finding a new artist to put the series together?
Um, well, Dave Dwanch helped me quite a bit with that. He had a artist friend who he'd been wanting to do a book with, but he didn't feel like any of the stuff he'd come up with quite fit right. So he introduced me to Mia Goodwin, who was a professor at SCAD at that point. In addition to you know doing some comics and animation stuff as well. So he introduced the two of us, and she liked the idea, so she worked on the first volume with me. And then after the first volume, she ended up going off to do her own series. And Dave ended up hooking me up with my current artist, Emily Martin, who's did volume 2 and is working on volume 4 of it right now. And she's another amazing artist who he'd met at a convention and wanted to do something with her and couldn't find anything right. So I get the people that Dave can't find a project for that he's writing.
Interesting. Now, did you make a conscious choice to have a female artist for the series, or was it just happenstance?
I wanted to have female artists on the series. All the short stories in particular are all female artists. I knew I was going to be doing a lot of stories there, and I wanted to, as part of the message of the book, make it sort of clear that there are women out there doing comics. That a girl who picks up that book and see Emily's name on the front and know that there are girls making comics like this, and that they can be part of that. They can do their own thing, because I think there's a lot more boys that sort of get indoctrinated into that culture early, and get told that they can create this stuff. And unfortunately, there's a lot of girls, I think, that don't know or don't find out until later that they could be making it too.
Well, it's interesting because I think the perception that a lot of the folks in the general audience have is that comics are just superheroes, and it's mostly for boys, and then when they hit puberty, then they stop reading comics. And we really see that over the last 20 or 30 years that isn't really the case, that there is a wide variety of books, but like you're saying, that there are a smaller number of female creators out there, but there are a few who are making large impacts in current mainstream comics. And it's interesting that we're now starting to see that come back. I mean, I think it's interesting that when you go to a convention, we met at the NC Comic-Con in Durham, just how many female fans there are, and cosplay is a big part of that as well. And when you see that, it's kind of sad that the program has to have a harassment policy printed in there, which doesn't say much for our comic industry.
Yeah, obviously I don't think it's a good thing that it has to exist. I do think it is a good thing that it does exist, and it's out there and visible and clear, so that people who are cosplaying and are there can know that they have recourse, that they have protection. There are people on their side, which unfortunately is not the case at some of the larger conventions to some extent. But yeah, I feel like there's always been girls reading comics. There's always been a lot of girls that are into the stuff, but I think it's become the case just recently that there's a lot more girls that feel comfortable being part of the community, that know that they can go to a convention and not have to deal with all that other stuff, that there will be other women there, that they can see female creators, that they have people telling them, no, this isn't just a guy thing. It's not going to be like comic conventions were not so long ago. And I think the thing with comics being a thing that's just for boys is interesting, in that it's something we kind of have taken for granted for a long time, but I don't think it's historically accurate. I mean, 'cause there was a time when comics weren't all superheroes, when there were a number of fantasy and romance and action and horror comics, and they had an audience as wide as movies have now, but the big companies, and it's really saw the the pull that the branding of superheroes had, and they kind of went exclusively for that. I think we're finally starting to get to a point where it's branching back out, and you're seeing a lot more of the other sides of comics, fantasy stuff and horror stuff, and we haven't really seen a romance revival yet, but there's a lot of auto-bio comics and stuff. So maybe the romance is coming.
Let's hope so. It is interesting. I think the internet has opened up a lot of avenues for people who weren't able to get their ideas out before, because you have just a handful of publishers, and distribution of printed comics is expensive, and you've got to go through a lot of hoops. So I think the internet has made a lot of inroads, so we're able to see more different flavors of comics out there. But I did want to ask, you were nominated for an Eisner Award, and I just wanted to get a little bit of feedback from you on what you thought about that whole process.
The Eisner Awards are interesting. It was a huge honor, obviously, to be nominated, and it's the initial nominations are done by a board of people who read theoretically everything that's submitted to them, and they find the best stuff and they put it out there for people to vote on, and then it gets the final vote is a much larger vote. Anybody who's professional in the comics community can vote. So to some extent, it's a little difficult to gauge quality so much as popularity. In the final rounds, we were up against a lot of good stuff when we were up for best single issue, but we were up against Mark Waid's Daredevil and Joe Hill's Lock and Key and Unwritten, all of which were comics that had more people who subscribed to those than there are people that knew about Princeless at that point. So, Mark Waid won. I think he had every right to win with that issue of Daredevil. I think it was a great book. It's a tough process. We basically spent a couple of months when people were voting just trying to get it in front of as many people as we could, which is a surprisingly difficult task, even if you're giving it away. So, trying to hit as many people as Marvel can hit on a single Wednesday. So it's a tough thing.
Mm-hmm. But again, I guess that's a big boon to your career, to be nominated with essentially a small press behind you.
Yeah, I think it was a big help for Princeless and for Action Lab. We managed to get a lot more sort of bigger name creators, I think, that were interested in the company, due partially to the recognition and partially to getting a chance to see Princeless and see what Action Lab was doing. So we brought in people like Jeremy Dale and Jamal Eigel and Ray Height, and all the great books that we have coming out now are people who saw kind of the noise we were making and decided to take a chance on Action Lab, which I think is a brave thing in the market, and I think hopefully it's paid off for them.
And I wanted to touch base. You're also working for IDW, I believe.
Yeah, I'm doing some work on My Little Pony over there, as well as I've got a short coming up in the Cartoon Network book. I've got a Courage the Cowardly Dog short story coming out.
Okay, now this is a tough question, but I think it's one that people don't necessarily understand the difference between a book for children versus an all-ages book. Could you touch on that a little?
Yeah, I like to write toward all ages. I think there are some people who have an idea of what kids want, and they aim books specifically at a younger age. They push them to be educational in a very basic sense, or to tell a story that is kid specific. Whereas all ages, I try to write stuff that I think I would enjoy reading, but is not inappropriate for kids. There's nothing that I have to tell parents, oh well, you might not want them to read this because this, that, and the other, but at the same time has that appeal for adults when they can read it. There are jokes there that they'll get and they'll enjoy, and there's some the kids might not get, which I think is a spot where comics has been a little behind like animation, because there have been animated features like that for several years now. But that's my big thing is I don't like talking down to kids. I don't like giving the feeling that like they won't get it. I like trusting that they'll get the stuff, and making sure that I explain it correctly enough that anybody should be able to get it. Not feeling like I have to hold their hand about it.
And as far as constructing a story, how does that? Is there any difference between how you would construct a story for an all ages book versus a book that might be geared more towards an adult audience?
Um, the biggest thing that I try to do with Princeless that I think a lot of the comics from some of the bigger publishers don't do is to have stories that are um, a length that kids could read them in a sitting or a couple of sittings, where basically we break up Princeless into books. So the 4 issues will make one story. So there's a plot line that's done at the end of that story, and it ties into the next story, much the way something like Atomic Robo or Hellboy does, where you can finish a thing and enjoy that story as it is. You don't necessarily have to buy the next 4 issues to enjoy the 4 issues you have. Whereas I think there's been a tendency in mainstream comics of late to do 12, 16, 20 issue story arcs where it takes a year and a half to get through one story, where if you buy one single issue, at the end of it you might not feel like you got much for your money. I like the big serialized kind of storytelling, but it's nice to be able to get sort of bite-sized chunks, and to feel like you're satisfied after a story without having to go, I wish I had the next issue.
Well, that's true, especially with, it seems that a lot of the mainstream publishers, the Marvel, the DC books, are written for the trade audience. So the individual issues aren't as important as the collected volume, whether it's 6 issues, 12 issues, or like you're saying 18 to 24 issues, where you don't actually have a sense of where the story is going when you pick up that one issue. It's kind of hard as a new reader to get a hold of that. And if you have a smaller arc, I would imagine it's easier for someone to get involved and be invested in that.
Yeah, I think so, and I think um, kids are less likely to have the attention span to follow 100 different storylines from 12 different Avengers or Justice Leaguers, that are going on over years of a story, as opposed to being able to get a whole story in a couple of issues at the most.
And another question I have for you is you said that you write some jokes that are for the adult audiences, maybe the parents who are reading the book, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a parent. It could just be anyone who wants to read a good book. Have you found yourself in a situation where you put something in, or you thought about putting something in, and you had to pause for a moment and just wonder if that would be, a little too risky or risque?
Um, to some extent, I have to monitor myself a little bit, because I think one of the, not so much with the humor, but one of the biggest issues I've had is, in the first issue of my story, I gave my heroine a sword, and it's a little difficult to pull off stabbing in an all ages comic without it becoming an issue. So I was like, wow, I wish I'd given her a non-pointed weapon. That would make this a lot easier. If she could hit somebody without slicing them. So I've had to get kind of inventive with how my fights go, and keep try to keep that much more on the GPG side of things. There's also been, I have to occasionally look at what I want to do as far as story, and think about the things that I want to support and I want to represent, and how I want to work those things into a story, because I want to make sure, that we get lots of diversity and lots of different experiences and lots of different types of characters that unfortunately don't see a lot of time in big comics, and that other people can pick up the comic and see themselves represented in it.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because if you work for another publisher and you're using like a licensed property that you're writing the book for, you may not have as much say as you would have as a creator with your own property. Have you come across anything where you had to maybe make an ethical choice based on, well, this is what the publisher is wanting me to do in a sort of a work for hire environment?
I haven't had any instances where it's been an ethical choice. I've had some story issues on My Little Pony stuff occasionally, where I have an idea that I really like for a story, and either Hasbro doesn't like it, or they have another story planned that's going very much in the same direction. So I have to kind of change around what I want to do. At the same time, it's kind of nice to play in somebody else's sandbox and not have to make everything from the ground up. That I can kind of pitch an idea for My Little Pony, and I know what that should sound like. Having watched, the series, I know what an episode of My Little Pony looks like. I know how it begins. I know how it ends. It's just kind of figuring out what that story is in the middle. It's like, okay, well, how do I get from point A to point B, and what sort of lesson do I want to be in this? Because that's a definite thing with My Little Pony, is we've got lessons, we're learning things about people and friendship and things like that. So.
Interesting. So Hasbro has it's interesting that you're saying that Hasbro will come to you with ideas, or I guess they'll go to the publisher with their ideas. And is that based on a product that they're launching, or is that just I'm not sure how Hasbro directs their creator content.
Yeah, for the most part, most of the comics that come out are pitched to IDW, and then IDW pitches to Hasbro. There are a few cases where Hasbro is doing something in the show, like when they did their Equestria Girls movie, and then when they have brought in a couple of things since then, like the Power Ponies and things like that, where they want somebody to do a story with these particular characters or in this particular style. And for the most part, they're very good about letting you, try stuff out and do what you want to do. And they'll take a hard line on things occasionally, but for the most part, they're very giving as far as letting you play with their toys.
Here's one other question. I think this goes back to being a female fan. What are your thoughts on bronies?
So I think it's the thing with bronies is a thing that's very much the case with a lot of big fan bases, big fandoms. Is there's kind of this 90-10 rule where 90% of the bronies I meet and come in contact with, they're great people. They're nice guys. They are interested in buying stuff. They love the show. And there is like a 10% of them that is loud and rabid and crazy, and wants very particular things, have emotional feelings and investments in the characters that are maybe not appropriate to have about animated characters in general. And have generally, my biggest issue is there are some bronies who feel the need to run women and children out of the fandom, or to take a ownership of fandom, which I think is that's a real issue. A lot of them are much more inclusive and much happier to pull people in and share that. And I've seen a lot of bronies that have been encouraging and nice to little fans that are at shows. But there is that 10% I think that needs to be addressed and quieted down a bit, if because I think that's a lot of what people end up seeing is the really loud 10%. And unfortunately, they're very happy to make themselves known.
Well, I see we have about 3 minutes left, and I wanted to ask you a question about your writing process. So I'm assuming that you're working full script, but I was just wondering how long it takes for you to develop the idea, to pitch it, to script it, and get it to the artist.
It is a wide fluctuation, because there've been stories where I have an idea, and I'll sit down and I'll just kind of bang out what the characters are, and I'll be like, okay, I just want to write a script for this, and I'll do a script, and I'll end up showing it around, or show it to an artist that I think might be interested in it, and then suddenly we're doing a comic. And there have been cases where like I'll have an idea and I'll write it down in a notebook, and it's not quite there, or it's not quite what I'm looking for, and I'll come back to it occasionally and work on it some, and think I know there's a thing here, but you got to keep just kind of chipping away at it, and 6 months, a year, 2 years later, it'll be something that I'm like, hey, I have a script now, you should check this out and see what you think. So I've got a lot of different things I'm working on at any given time, so when I run out of gas on one, I just switch over to another and try to keep going.
Okay. I see that we're getting close. We have about a minute left in the show here. So it's interesting that you can work on an idea. It's a lot of the comic writers that we've spoken to. They're dealing with that monthly deadline, and I always wonder how a guy like Mark Waid can be writing 6 or 7 books at a time, or maybe it's up to a dozen at this point. But it seems like you've got a little bit more flexibility in your schedule, in that you can work on something, let it ferment until you get the idea just right.
Yeah, at this point, I do some, work for hire. I have some deadlines, but it's not anywhere near what somebody like Mark is doing, where they have so many scripts they have to turn around. I would be very happy to be in that position where I'm doing enough comic book writing that I can't sit and think about it too long. But I think that's sort of the luxury of being in a spot where I have a creator-owned book and I have some work, but at this point comics is still not my full-time job, so I have a little leeway on doing stuff, and I can afford to do 15 conventions like I did this year.
Well, I'm being told that we are out of time. Jeremy, thank you so much for speaking to us. I'd like to thank all of you for watching Comic Culture. We've been talking with Jeremy Whitley, creator of Princeless. We hope to see you again next time for another episode of Comic Culture.